If you walk through Hastings today, surrounded by orchards and vineyards, it is easy to forget that this region was once one of New Zealand's industrial powerhouses. Beneath Hawke's Bay's agricultural identity lies a history of steam, steel, bottling lines, and factory whistles. Two companies stand at the centre of that story: Leopard Brewery and Wattie's. Both were based in Hastings, both shaped everyday Kiwi life. And for decades, their histories developed alongside one another, sometimes separately, sometimes intersecting at key industrial moments that reflected wider national change. Brewing in Hastings dates back to around 1880 when George Ellis established what became known as the Burton Brewery. As with many small colonial enterprises, early records vary slightly in dates and ownership transitions, but Ellis is generally credited as the founder. In the early 1890s, the business passed to Edward Newbigin, an employee who took over operations. From there, the brewery evolved through mergers and ownership changes, typical of regional firms adapting to a growing colony. At some point in the early 20th century, the Leopard name emerged. The exact date of its formal adoption is not consistently documented, but by mid-century, the Leopard brand was firmly established in Hawke's Bay and beyond. The brewery produced traditional ales and stouts, and later beers, such as Leopard Strong Beer and Leopard Export Lager. These were not fringe products. They were widely distributed across the lower North Island, and became familiar fixtures in pubs, working men's clubs, and family gatherings. By the mid-20th century, however, the brewing landscape in New Zealand was shifting. Consolidation became common. Smaller regional breweries were increasingly absorbed into larger corporate structures. Leopard eventually operated within a system that would later evolve into Lion breweries. The benefits were scale and distribution. The cost was a gradual loss of local independence. While Leopard was navigating those structural changes, another enterprise was expanding rapidly only streets away. In 1934, James Wattie founded J. Wattie Canneries Limited in Hastings. His vision was straightforward: preserve the region's abundant produce so it could be consumed year-round. In an area defined by orchards and market gardens, canning offered economic stability and the ability to reach a national market. Growth came steadily. From modest beginnings, Wattie's expanded through the 1940s and 1950s to become one of the region's largest employers. Factory lines processed peas, beans, and fruit destined for households across New Zealand. The Wattie's name became embedded in daily life, printed on labels stacked in kitchen cupboards nationwide. By the late 1950s, both companies were entering a period defined by technology and expansion. At its King Street plant, Wattie's invested in advanced can-making and processing equipment. This was not simply about filling tins, it included the manufacture of steel containers from flat sheets of tin plate. Large stacks of metal were cut, rolled into cylindrical shapes, soldered and sealed. Hastings was not just growing food, it was producing industrial packaging at scale. At the same time, beer consumption habits were changing. Internationally, canned beer was gaining popularity. In New Zealand, Leopard is widely recognised in regional histories as the first brewery in the country to can its beer. That development was closely linked to Wattie's manufacturing capability. In 1959 and 1960, specialised can-making lines were installed at the Wattie's plant in Hastings, marking the beginning of large-scale beer can production in New Zealand. Personal recollections from those who worked around the machinery describe heaps of flat sheet metal that would soon become beer cans. These containers were produced locally before being filled with Leopard beer. The early cans required a separate opener, one puncture to release air, another to pour or drink. Later, tear tabs were introduced, punched directly from tin plate by heavy presses. Among the machinery remembered from the factory floor was the 80-ton stole press, powerful enough to shake the building as it stamped out lids. Blue and gold diamond-patterned Leopard cans soon appeared across the lower North Island, signalling a new era in beer packaging. Then came interruption. On the 19th of February 1962, a major fire broke out at the Wattie's factory in Hastings. Contemporary reports confirm that significant portions of the plant were destroyed. There were no fatalities, but the damage disrupted production. During this period, production of Leopard's beer cans was reportedly shifted temporarily to the United States. Accounts differ slightly in detail, but multiple sources reference overseas manufacture following the fire. Rebuilding began quickly. Within months, the factory was restored and local can production resumed. The recovery became part of regional industrial memory, evidence of resilience and coordinated effort. By the mid to late 1960s, can making in Hastings was once again operating at full capacity. Through the 1960s and 1970s, both Leopard and Wattie's continued at scale. Leopard expanded distribution across much of the North Island, while Wattie's maintained strong domestic and export markets. Steel containers filled on humming lines, some destined for supermarket shelves, others for hotel bars and sports clubs. In practical terms, one factory preserved produce, the other brewed beer, but during this period they were linked by technology and geography. By the 1980s, however, broader economic forces were reshaping New Zealand industry. Brewing operations were consolidated further. Leopard underwent rebranding, at times operating as Hastings Brewery and later Hawke's Bay Brewery. Aluminium increasingly replaced tin plate and beverage packaging, and production became more centralised in larger urban facilities. Precise closure records vary, but brewing operations in Hastings ceased in the late 1990s. The site was repurposed and eventually became home to the Farmlands Cooperative Society. The Leopard name survived primarily through memorabilia, vintage cans, labels, signage, tangible reminders of a once prominent regional brewery. Wattie's story evolved differently. In 1992, the company was acquired by Heinz, later becoming part of the global Kraft Heinz group. Ownership shifted offshore, but the Wattie's brand remained deeply connected to New Zealand households. For decades, both companies represented Hawke's Bay's industrial ambition, not as competitors but as complementary forces. One transformed grain into beer, the other preserved fruit and vegetables for a nation. At their intersection stood steel cans, stamped and assembled in Hastings, filled with local product and distributed across New Zealand. It is easy, in retrospect, to separate these stories into distinct corporate histories, but on the ground, in mid-20th century Hastings, they were intertwined. Workers shared streets, freight shared rail lines. Industrial knowledge circulated within the same community. Whether directly linked by formal contract at every stage or connected simply by geography and timing, Leopard Brewery and Wattie's together reflect a period when regional industry helped shape national life. Hastings was once more than orchards. It was an engine room of New Zealand manufacturing, a place where vats boiled, presses thundered, and steel met steam. The memory of that era survives not only in archives and photographs, but in the objects left behind. A faded label, a blue and gold can, a factory floor remembered for the way it shook when the press came down. So what do you think? Did you or a family member work at Leopard Breweries? Or at Wattie's? If you enjoyed this short stroll down memory lane, drop a comment below and suggestions on what we should cover next. And as always, stay curious.